A couple weeks ago, we looked at the Day of Atonement, which is the most holy day in the Jewish calendar. And we did so because we have, through this year, been talking about all of the Jewish festivals and Christian festivals even, as they have come up on our calendar year, in order to gain a deeper appreciation for what it is that's celebrated, and perhaps why it should be just as pertinent, if not more so, for us as we look at them. There were a few times that perhaps the discussion was a little bit delayed for various reasons throughout the year, but as we're now drawing relatively close to the end of the year, we really only have a couple more to talk about. And one of those was actually concluded on Friday. Had I been here last week, this is what we would have talked about last week, which would have been right in the middle of it. But this last Friday marked the ending of the Jewish festival known as Sukkot. This morning, I want to talk about this Jewish festival, Sukkot, or also called the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles. Good morning. Isn't it? It's good to sing these songs. Here we are, straying pilgrims, reminding ourselves that we have a hope that is in front of us, a much greater hope that I think is something that we will pull away from the lesson, hopefully, this morning. It's good to spend time around the table proclaiming the Lord's death this morning, as we do, as we not just proclaim his death, but we proclaim his death with an expectation of his return. It's much more than just the fact that Jesus died, but that he rose, that he ascended, and he will come again, and that we have this fellowship here together as a people who are joined together by our faith and our love for our Lord and our Savior, the one who gives us the hope that we have. It's good to be here with you and to have this opportunity to worship with you this morning. We do have some who are visiting with us, and we're really glad that you are with us this morning. It makes us feel pretty special that you decided to come and spend time with us, and I hope that you will feel special as well by the time that you spend with us this morning. Now, as we begin talking about the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tents, the Feast of Tabernacles, as much as the last holiday, holy day, that we talked about was somber, and the Day of Atonement was not a festive occasion at all. In fact, the wording probably assumes a fast day, so they wouldn't be actually eating as they were to humble themselves on that day. This holiday is truly a festival, or it's a series of feast days. This is actually one of the most fun that they have as they create these booths for the family to live in. Now, as I had up on the slide just a moment ago, the Feast of Tabernacles, it's often called that. Perhaps you might even see that in your Old Testament. I'm actually not certain why that word choice was used. The word that's associated with the tabernacle is actually a completely different word. Even the word associated with tent is a completely different word. This word is a word that has to do with creating some kind of a temporary structure, a lean-to type of a thing. So I'm not sure why the translation tabernacles was chosen. Although in the Greek, the Septuagint rendering of the Old Testament in Greek, in the Greek language, the word is going to be the exact same word, whether you're talking about tabernacle, tent, lean-to, all of that. It's all just, they just have one word for it, so maybe that has something to do with it. But really, the idea of the Sukkot is a booth. It's a little shelter of sorts. The Jews would build it, and they would construct it, and they would typically put like leaves, palm leaves and such, on the top of it And that way they could leave some holes that they're able to see up into the sky. Usually the walls are constructed out of fabric. And through the course of the feast, they would eat all of their meals in this temporary structure, and even go so far as to have the family sleep inside of these booths. And so the festival would last for 8 days. Technically, it's a 7-day holiday, but at the end of it, they add on what's called a Shemna Atzeret, which marks the end of the agricultural year, and then the Shemna Torah, which marked the end of the Torah reading cycle. And so those two things kind of converge together. So you have the first day, which begins the whole festival, and then you have another day on the 8th day. 2 days are the holy days. Those would be the Sabbath days of this festival, the high Sabbath days. No work is permitted on the first day or the 8th day of Sukkot. But through the rest of the week, they're still able to work, go about their normal business, except obviously the day that lands on the Sabbath day itself. So because the focus of this festival is thanksgiving or thankfulness to God, it's thankfulness that God brought the people of Israel safely through their wandering in the wilderness and then brought them into a land where he stopped providing them with manna and instead began to provide them with their harvest. And so this becomes connected to the harvest itself. So let's talk about the feast as you see it within the law of Moses itself, Exodus chapter 23 and verse 16. We're very early, by the way, in the law of Moses. Remember right here, Exodus chapter 19 is when they came to Mount Sinai, and that's where the Lord told them, you will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. He gave them their instruction, what they were going to be. Chapter 20, remember, chapter 19 is where he appeared to them, and he spoke to them from the mountain, and you had the smoke and the sound of the thunder, the lightning. All of that was taking place. The earthquake. That's in chapter 19. Chapter 20, remember, is the giving of the 10 Commandments. And then you have chapters 21, 22, and 23. These are what form the book of the covenant, upon these words, they would enter into a covenant with God in chapter 24. All of this to say, we are really early. At this point, we are really early in Israel's timeline. So in Exodus chapter 23, it says, you shall keep the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in from the field the fruit of your labor. So this feast, it's the feast of ingathering, the last harvest, and part of this is a thankfulness to God for the bountiful harvest that was given for the year. Now, keep in mind, there is no mention here in Exodus chapter 23 of them living in booths, right? There is no discussion that says, hey, I want you to build these booths and do this. There's no mention of that, not even calling it the Feast of Booths in any way. Doesn't that seem odd? Why would God have the feast and call it the Feast of Ingathering in Exodus chapter 23? They haven't lived in booths yet, right? Bear in mind, this predates their decision in Numbers chapters 13 and 14. This predates their decision not to enter into the land. This predates the 40 years of wandering that they had in the wilderness. All of this was a feast that God had already ordained was going to happen, that they would have a feast of ingathering that was already part of the law, and it had nothing to do with the booths at that point in time, because as of yet, there is no booths necessarily. They've just spent a few months away from Egypt, and it's not going to be long. They're going to be here at the mountain for about a year or so, and then, according to God's timeline, They're going to go up into the land, except they refused to do it. And that's what necessitated a much more lengthy discussion. You come into Leviticus chapter 23. Now, by the way, we're on the other side of the 40 years of wandering. That's already taken place. Remember, it was it says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of the 7th month, 7 days, the feast of booths to the Lord. And on the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do ordinary work for 7 days. You shall present food offerings to the Lord, and on the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It's a solemn assembly. You shall not do ordinary work. I misspoke a second ago. If you were in Numbers 23, they would be on the other side of it. Here in Leviticus chapter 23, they're still there, but we're nearing the ending of the year that they have spent around the mountain at this point. Keep on going. This was read by Paneeth for us. I think Paneeth read this just a few moments ago in verses 39 through 43. And so he says, once again, 15th day of the 7th month, when you've gathered in the produce. So again, this is the Feast of Ingathering. Under discussion, you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord for 7 days. You shall take on the first day the fruit of the splendid trees, branches of the palm trees, the bough of the leafy trees, the willows of the brook, and rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days, and celebrate it as a feast of the Lord for 7 days in the year. It is a statute forever throughout your generations. Celebrate it in the 7th month. Dwell in booths for 7 days. All native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So now we have the Feast of Ingathering being very specifically tied to the Feast of Booths. And we know what's going to take place. They will have the 40 years in which God fed them. God took care of them. They wandered in the wilderness for that 40-year time period, much longer than God originally intended for them to spend there. But remember, they said, we won't do it. We'd rather die here in the wilderness than go up and fight. And God said, okay, if you'd rather die in the wilderness, I can let you die in the wilderness, and your children will go up into the land. And we know all of that history. And so for that 40-year period of time, God led them around, and remember, God was providing food for them. Going all the way back to Exodus, when they had the testing narratives and chapter 16, 17, around in that time frame, and God began providing manna for them. And the manna lasted the entire time, the entire 40 years, all the way up to the point in Joshua chapter 5, when they had crossed the Jordan River, and they'd come into the land, and they were right there before the city of Jericho. And after they celebrated the Passover together, they began to eat the fruit of the land that was there, and the manna stopped at that point. And so God was taking care of them and providing for them. Everything was temporary for them, even the food they were going to get, until they entered into the land. And they're commemorating the harvest that God provides is intrinsically tied to entering into the land and no longer just living as nomadic people in tents. Which is probably why this feast is also attached to those years of wandering, as we see right here in this discussion. They were to create these makeshift tent booths to live in for the week. This was so that future generations would know that when God brought them out of Egypt, he brought them out, they dwelled in these booths. And again, this is all about reminding Israel from generation to generation of God's oversight and God's protection. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 8, this is a fantastic chapter which talks about the providence of God for his people and a reminder for them not to get too arrogant about themselves. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, starting verse 11, God says, "Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his rules, and his statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and you are full, and you have built good houses, and you live in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and silver and your gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth." See, this is the fear that God has for them, that they'll get into the land. God will provide for them and bring them into the land. And after a few years, they'll start to build nice houses for themselves. They'll have prosperous years of harvest where they bring stuff in. They'll multiply, well, just multiply. There will be lots of them and lots of stuff. And their life will become nice and cushy, and they'll enjoy it, and life will just be great. And they'll look around and they'll say, look at all of this that I have done. And the Lord God says, yeah, no, you didn't. This is the work that I have painstakingly put together all the way back to the day I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And I took care of you. I brought you through the wilderness. It was harsh. It was horrible. It was a death trap, and you survived. You didn't have any water, so I brought you water even out of a rock. You didn't have any food, so I rained down food on you. I brought you to this area to test you. Yeah, life was very difficult for them. But it was very difficult. Let me just put it this way. It was not nearly as difficult as it would have been otherwise. This is, by the way, that same passage in Deuteronomy 8 where God talks about how their clothing, did they realize that their clothing never wore out, that nothing caused any problems, that everything was okay? He's tying all of this, I think, to the idea of the Feast of Booths. It is really a reminder of all of this information from Deuteronomy chapter 8. This feast, to bring them back to the time when they lived in these booths in the wilderness. This was a time that Israel was completely and wholly dependent on God for food, for sustenance, and it served as a reminder for them every year. There was a time Israel was led solely 100% by God. They didn't go out and do their own thing. They followed the Lord through the wilderness. Every year, when they were reminded, when that cloud got up and it started, they had to pack up all their stuff, all of their booths, and journey on until they found a spot where they stopped and set it up again. But when they get fully settled into the land, I think the Feast of Booths is there to remind them and to add even more importance. Because remember, the people are not the only ones who are living in a tent. I think it's really interesting in Chronicles chapter 7, as you get to Solomon's dedication of the temple, it says at that time, Solomon held the feast for 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great assembly from Lebo Hamath to the brook of Egypt. And on the 8th day, they held a solemn assembly for they had kept the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. So on the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away to their homes joyful and glad of heart, for the prosperity that the Lord had granted to David, to Solomon, to Israel his people. Thus Solomon finished the house of the Lord, the king's house. All that Solomon had planned to do in the house of the Lord and in his own house, he successfully accomplished. Notice that Solomon sends everyone home the 23rd of the 7th month, the day after the feast ends, this 8th day, which means the dedication ended on the final day of the feast. This isn't just a coincidence. Solomon doesn't just accidentally say, hey, let's wrap up the commemoration of the permanent dwelling of the Lord on the day that they are reminded to live in booths. I think he's reappropriating now the Feast of Booths for another purpose. Because now the Feast of Booths is not just a reminder of when the people lived in tents. This is now a reminder of the time that God lived in a tent as well. From this point, he will no longer. But it's important to remember, even though they have now arrived, they need to remember where they came from. Even though they had the temple for 500 plus years, even though now they have a temple, for the past 500 plus years, their God lived in a tent just like they had. And now the Feast of Booths becomes a reminder of more than just that Israel lived in tents. God did too. But ultimately, even though this is a feast that looks backward, as with just about everything else we find in the Old Testament, with every festival that we have talked about so far, I think we know where we're going. There's a future-looking element that is wrapped up in Jesus. In John chapter 1 and verse 14, this is the end of a very lengthy part right there. The introduction actually keeps going all the way to about verse 18. But this is the culminating moment in John's introduction to his gospel, where he says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And then he moves forward talking about how the Word was instrumental in creation and everything else. He moves forward to verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now remember before when I said that in the Greek aspect of the Septuagint, that is, remember the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that when you get there, they don't have separate words for a tabernacle or a tent or booth or whatever the case is. It's just one word that's used. And I think that's significant because that means that when John writes this about Jesus, that Jesus dwelt, he doesn't use the word that Jesus lived with us. What he does is he takes the Greek word for tent and he turns it into a verb. You might as well say that Jesus tented among us is kind of the idea. This is not the normal word that you would expect for someone to use to say that he lived with. He's doing something very special here in his language or his word usage. In fact, it could be that he tented, or maybe even that Jesus tabernacled among us, and we beheld his glory. Make no mistake, John may write grammar-wise on like maybe a second or third grade level, but his theology is off the charts. John doesn't just do things arbitrarily. If John uses this word right here, there is incredible significance for what he's trying to get as he talks about the fact that Jesus, the God of all creation, there in the very beginning, who is God, when he came here, he tabernacled with us. He tented with us. That is, his flesh was like a tabernacle. His flesh was like a tent. His flesh was like a booth that he tented among us. See, the Feast of Booths is all about the fact that God's people and man all lived in temporary shelters. And then Solomon, upon building the permanent temple, reminds us God once lived in a temporary shelter as well. Well, folks, what is Jesus? Is Jesus not God and man together as one? That the God of all creation now lives as a man with a man body in a temporary structure of sorts. And hopefully you start picking up what I'm laying down here. Jesus living here was looked at and was regarded as a temporary dwelling for God in the flesh. Thus for us, this whole Feast of Booths holiday where we remember and commemorate the time that God was in a tent with his people wandering in the wilderness as straying pilgrims trying to get to the land of promise that was to come, that all of that is now fulfilled as we and Jesus are in the flesh, and that Jesus becomes man and God at the same time, living in this booth of a body, straying pilgrim, leading us to the land of promise. The Feast of Booths has just as much relevance for us in our day and in our circumstance as those who are forward-looking, trying to get to that place where we have our permanent dwelling with God in God's land. See, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and the bulletin article this morning talks about this, and normally what I'll do if I write a bulletin article that talks about it, I'll say, just look at the bulletin article and then I'll move on. I won't do that this morning, though. I decided I want to talk about this morning and not just leave it to the bulletin article. So who knows, if you read the bulletin article, you may say, oh, wow, that's different from what Chris said in the sermon. That may happen. It's always possible. But I think it's important to understand what's going on here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He says, we know that if this tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened. Not that we want to be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now, in the context here, chapter 5, this is one of those chapter breaks. They're necessary. You have to put chapter breaks in if you're going to do chapters and verses, and you have to find a spot somewhere. But this really is a continuation of his discussion in chapter 4. And remember, in chapter 4, Dave, I think on Wednesday night, just talked about 2 Corinthians 4 and the momentary light affliction that's talked about there, by which we are looking forward to it. It's producing an eternal weight of glory in the heavenly places, right? And so as he's talking about this to them in chapter 4, he's talking about persecution. This is the passage where he calls these bodies jars of clay, if you remember that discussion. And his whole point is that God could have, if he'd so desired, the gospel message, as important as it is, he could have done anything that he wanted to do to send that message out. Instead, what does he do? He puts it in us, who are inherently fragile beings. That is remarkable, by the way. I think I've used this illustration probably before. I'll use it again. How many of y'all have something that's very special and dear to you? Something that is just so important to you. Like your 1989 King Griffey Jr. Upper Deck rookie card, right? I mean, I'm talking really important stuff to you. Yeah, you want to protect it. You want to keep it safe. And so the best thing to probably do is to just throw it into a Kleenex box, right? That'll keep it safe, won't it? You know what Kleenex box is, right? You know what I'm talking about, those little cheap little flimsy cardboard things. How many of y'all think that that's a good way to keep your investment safe, this prized possession of yours? No, that's Paul's point. We are about as sturdy as a Kleenex box. You know, persecution, they come to us, they can beat us, they can whip us, they can take our lives and make us cease to exist. And God said, yeah, that's where I want to put the most important, precious, powerful thing that's ever been created. And it's worked. It has worked unbelievably well. Because as much as we get crushed and as much as we get destroyed, the message of the gospel spreads even further and it goes even greater. It was the most amazing way for God to demonstrate the power of the gospel is in the gospel message itself. It's not in us. All we do is give ourselves over to it. And we do so with the knowledge and with the understanding. What's the worst that they can do to us? Take my life away from me? Okay. If this earthly tent, this body dies, if it gets destroyed, is that the end for me? No. That's the worst you can do. You don't have a greater power over me. We need to see, as he's talking about here, these earthly bodies as tents. And by the way, this is a metaphor. This is an analogy, and if you take it to its furthest extent, it's always going to break down at some point. We understand that, right? You know, we're not supposed to say, well, this body is a tent, and that's just, it's a way to understand, because we are longing and yearning for permanent bodies, permanent homes. But don't hear what I'm not saying, or I think what Paul's not saying. Because if you go back to his first letter that he sent using a lot of the same language, he let them know this body will be our future body. This body, this tent, will be used as our permanent home. And so let Paul say what he's saying in the midst of this. I mean, that's his whole point, isn't it? When he says, in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, so that we not be found naked. Not that we would be unclothed. In other words, the whole point of this discussion is not saying we want to shed a body so that our spirit can go somewhere, right? That would be unclothed. That's what that would be. In other words, there is a body still that is involved in our permanent home. And that's 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This mortal must become immortal. This flesh must become, or this corruptible must become incorruptible. All of that type of stuff. So there's a real sense, then, that we understand that we live in this tent, and what our longing, what our hope, what our desire for is for this tent to be changed into that which is permanent, into that which is glorious, into that which is perfect. And there is a real sense in which the Feast of Booths is all about us dwelling in these booths right now, these permanent structures, as God did, just as Jesus was one of us with the hope that just as Jesus was bodily raised from the dead and that body changes, we will be bodily raised from the dead and our bodies will change. And this body will no longer be a tent. We will then be clothed with our permanent, immortal, imperishable, perfect dwelling places. And I think as you look, again, at what Jesus tells them in John chapter 15, maybe not exactly the same discussion, but very close to it. Remember the promise that Jesus tells them. Remember, this is the end, by the way. They've already done the Last Supper, the washing of the feet, all of that. where we're in the very last night in John chapter 14, and he tells his disciples, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. That is, there are many places in my Father's house. If it were not so, would I have told you I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. The final of the Jewish holidays that you see here that we have been talking about so far, this one that we've come to, is a holiday, a holy day, a festival that's just as important for us. For those of us who are in Christ, the new Israel, who knows just as God brought Israel from tents into a promised land, we have the fulfillment of what Israel is all about, that when our Christ returns, we will enjoy a permanent dwelling in our promised land with him. Let's pray together. Our Father in heaven, we bow before you, recognizing you as a holy God, a loving God, a God faithful to your promises. We thank you for the promise of a home with you, even though right now we live in these booths. We thank you especially for your Son who dwelt in his tent among us and died to give us life. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.